When a hostile federal judge with a growing disdain for constitutional watchdogs attempts to intimidate civil rights attorney Denzel Washington during a critical testimony, he believes he has full control of the proceedings. But when Washington pushes back with devastating evidence, justice strikes a thunderous blow that leaves the entire courtroom in stunned silence. The morning began routinely at the federal courthouse, except Judge Emmet Sullivan was displaying particularly vindictive behavior. "Remove that cell phone from my chambers," he barked at his assistant, making the young man stumble backward in fear. Without pause, he snapped and notified defense counsel, "If they're not seated in 60 seconds, I'll be issuing citation orders." The packed gallery watched as Judge Sullivan ascended to his bench, his expression already twisted with irritation. His reputation for unpredictable rulings and a volatile temper had only intensified in recent months, especially in cases involving controversial political figures. A court assistant approached nervously. "Your Honor, Attorney Denzel Washington has arrived to provide his testimony." Sullivan's demeanor darkened at once. "How wonderful for us," he muttered, making no attempt to mask his disdain. "Make sure he understands this is a federal courtroom, not a press conference on Capitol Hill. In here, his reputation carries no weight whatsoever." The atmosphere shifted the moment Denzel Washington entered the room. He walked with composed confidence, respectfully acknowledging court personnel as he made his way to the witness stand. But Judge Sullivan stared at him like a hawk sizing up its prey, rhythmically tapping his pen on the wooden surface. His irritation was palpable. Tension blanketed the room. Everyone in the gallery could feel it. This wasn't just another testimony. This was a confrontation years in the making. Sullivan didn't merely disapprove of constitutional attorneys who challenged institutional power, he despised them. And Denzel Washington, a respected defender of civil liberties, stood as a direct threat to everything Sullivan aimed to protect. The judge leaned forward aggressively, his voice steeped in disdain. "Let's establish the ground rules immediately." The courtroom fell completely silent. "I don't care what titles you carry in the eyes of the public. In this courtroom, I am the law. Do you comprehend that, Mr. Washington?" Denzel met the judge's harsh stare without flinching. "Perfectly, Your Honor. I'm here solely to tell the truth." "Truth?" Sullivan scoffed with theatrical sarcasm. "We'll determine that shortly." He turned toward the defense table, his irritation mounting. "Now let's begin this political performance, shall we?" But the moment the defense counsel began his opening statement, Sullivan cut him off. "For the record, I am already exhausted by the grandstanding infecting these proceedings." He cast a piercing glare toward Denzel. "This isn't a TED Talk or a civil rights rally." The attorney attempted to proceed. "Your Honor, we're simply laying the context of Mr. Harrison's philanthropic..." Sullivan erupted in mocking laughter. "Philanthropy? The only background that matters is this. Your client is facing charges of financial fraud. I don't need a bedtime story about his so-called community service." Each time the defense brought up Harrison's charitable work, the judge's hostility escalated. "Irrelevant," he snapped. "Move on. You won't receive another warning." The gavel slammed down again and again, so aggressively that the court stenographer struggled to keep up. But when Denzel Washington's testimony began, Judge Sullivan's demeanor spiraled out of control. "Stand upright when taking the oath," he barked, despite Denzel already standing with perfect posture, "and speak clearly. I will not tolerate political doublespeak in my courtroom." The condescension was blatant, but Denzel remained unshaken. "Your Honor," he replied calmly, "I can verify Mr. Harrison's financial transparency regarding the American Values Foundation." Sullivan rolled his eyes with theatrical disdain. "Oh, here we go again. Another myth wrapped in the flag of traditional American values." The gallery shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Even the prosecution began to show visible unease at how nakedly biased the judge was becoming. But Sullivan wasn't finished. He leaned in, his face flushed a dangerous crimson. "I've seen plenty of wealthy men try to shield their assets behind nonprofit veneers. Your presence doesn't impress me, Mr. Washington." Then with a malicious smirk, "In fact, it only makes me question the defendant's integrity even further." A ripple of hushed murmurs swept across the courtroom. The judge had cast off all appearance of neutrality. Still, Denzel Washington maintained his composure, a calm that seemed to enrage Judge Sullivan even more. The judge's hands trembled as he shuffled papers, his eyes darting nervously toward a particular folder on the bench. That's when Denzel delivered his first blow. "I have in my possession," he said evenly, "documented proof of Mr. Harrison's charitable distributions, including records from the February board meeting." Sullivan nearly leapt from his chair. "Those documents? are completely inadmissible, he shouted, though no one had objected. The courtroom fell utterly silent. Jurors exchanged wide-eyed glances. The defense attorney rose slowly. Your Honor, on what legal basis? Don't you dare challenge my authority, Sullivan snapped, his face now fully scarlet. One more word and you'll be sitting in a holding cell with your client. Even the prosecutor shifted uncomfortably. This had ceased being a trial. It had become a vendetta. Denzel spoke again, his voice respectful but firm. Your Honor, these documents were submitted properly during discovery. Sullivan let out a sharp, bitter laugh. Oh, were they now? And I suppose your federal friends didn't help you slide them in quietly. Then narrowing his eyes, let me explain something to you, Mr. Washington. You think you can stroll into my courtroom with your civil rights reputation and— Objection, Your Honor, the defense attorney interjected, finally finding his voice. But before he could finish, Sullivan slammed the gavel so hard the sound rang out like a gunshot. Sit down immediately. He roared. The room froze. Jury, gallery, even the court staff. Everyone now saw the truth. Judge Sullivan wasn't in control anymore. His fury had betrayed him, and Denzel Washington had revealed exactly who he was. Silence! Sullivan bellowed again, smashing his gavel repeatedly. The echoes bounced off the marble walls. This is absolutely unacceptable. Judge Sullivan's face was crimson, his breathing shallow and erratic. But Denzel Washington stood unfazed, calm, unreadable, unshaken. I will not tolerate lectures about courtroom decorum, Sullivan hissed, especially not from some glorified activist lawyer and his— Your Honor, Denzel interrupted smoothly, perhaps we should examine the specific details of the February 18th meeting. The shift in Sullivan's demeanor was instant and jarring. The rage flickered from his face, replaced by something more fragile. Was it fear? His hands still clenching the gavel froze mid-motion. He stared at Denzel as if seeing him not as a nuisance, but now as a serious threat. Those meetings are completely irrelevant to these proceedings, he muttered, his voice now brittle, uncertain. But his eyes betrayed him. They darted nervously toward a specific file resting beside him, a folder that hadn't been there the day before. Not relevant, Denzel asked gently, leaning in slightly. That's curious, Your Honor, considering those meetings directly addressed charitable donations tied to the very organization at the center of this case. Enough! Sullivan slammed both palms against the bench. The crack reverberated through the silent courtroom. One more word about those meetings, and I will have you physically removed. Gasps rippled across the gallery. The judge's mask of control was shattering before everyone's eyes. His hands now shook visibly as he fumbled with papers, trying to and failing to reassert command. His voice quivered with panic. In fact, I'm holding you in contempt, effective immediately. You think your public reputation shields you? You're nothing but a civil rights showman in an expensive suit. A wave of murmurs surged through the gallery. The prosecutor glanced nervously at the defense. The bailiffs exchanged uncertain, almost uneasy glances. Still, Denzel never raised his voice. He didn't need to. My reputation has nothing to do with this, he said quietly. He reached into his briefcase with deliberate calm. But since you've brought up protection, he withdrew a thick manila envelope. Perhaps we should discuss the protection payments made by the Progressive Justice Foundation. Judge Sullivan's face drained of all color. His jaw clenched, his breathing turned sharp and uneven. How dare you? He stammered, voice cracking. What payments? There were no— Guards! Guards! Remove this man immediately! But the court officers didn't move. Every single person in the courtroom now saw what was unfolding. Denzel calmly lifted a stack of papers from the envelope and held them high, turning slowly to allow jurors and observers to see. These banking records, he began, detail monthly wire deposits from shell entities whose names match perfectly with your prior rulings against nonprofit defendants, critical of the Progressive Justice Foundation. Shut up, Sullivan roared. It was a primal outburst, not of judicial authority, but of sheer desperation. You have no right, no standing. I am the law here, not some polished celebrity activist. Denzel remained still, then lifting another document with grace, he said, Your signature on these authorization forms, Your Honor, tells a different story. Sullivan lurched forward like a man about to collapse, jabbing a trembling finger at Denzel. You fabricated those documents. This is a setup, a political conspiracy. He stopped. He realized too late what he had just admitted. The room gasped, in unison. The judge's own words hung in the air like smoke after an explosion. A conspiracy? Denzel Washington repeated softly. Interesting word choice, Your Honor. especially given your private meetings with certain activist organizations. Judge Sullivan was now practically foaming at the mouth. I will not be interrogated in my own courtroom, he barked, voice cracking under pressure. You think you can just stroll in here with your smug little smirk and your evidence? He spat the final word as if it physically repulsed him. Denzel remained composed, unflinching. He calmly turned to another page. Evidence? He repeated. Evidence that reveals a deeply troubling pattern. He glanced toward the jury, allowing the weight of his words to settle. Like the Rodriguez case last month, where a small business owner lost everything because Your Honor refused to allow any evidence of his charitable contributions, just like today. Sullivan let out a wild, manic laugh. It was hollow and unhinged. The Rodriguez case? That conservative fraud got exactly what he deserved. They all do. These people think they can hide behind their precious, so-called patriotic values. The room froze. The words echoed. A confession wrapped in contempt. Even the prosecution looked stunned. Denzel didn't flinch. Or perhaps, he continued, lifting another document, we should review the Martinez hearing, where all case records were sealed just hours after your private meeting with representatives from the Progressive Justice Foundation. Sullivan's face twitched violently. His lips parted, but no sound came. How do you know about... He stopped. He had already said too much. Denzel tilted his head, calm and precise. Know about what, Your Honor? The meeting? Or the $200,000 deposited into your offshore account the next day? Sullivan froze. His entire body went rigid. The gavel slipped from his fingers and clattered onto the bench. The prosecutor stood abruptly. He now understood exactly what was happening. Jurors exchanged long, decisive glances. Their verdict was written on their faces. Sullivan hadn't just lost control. He had lost everything. The gallery erupted in shocked murmurs. The tension surged like a rising storm. Sullivan pounded his gavel, once, twice, again, but the strikes rang hollow. Order! I will have order in my courtroom. His voice cracked, frantic and panicked. This is fabricated. All of it. It's a conservative plot, just like Mrs. Washington's case. Denzel pressed forward, his tone steady. You mean the grandmother who lost her life savings after you blocked her financial disclosures? The same case where the corporation suing her had donated to your judicial campaign 3 weeks prior? Shut up, Sullivan screamed, completely unraveling. You have no right, no authority. I am the law here. No, Denzel replied softly, powerfully. You're not the law. You're supposed to serve the law. Remember? Like the day you took your oath of office. The same day you opened that account in Switzerland. Sullivan shot up from his seat, robes disheveled, pointing furiously. Guards, arrest this man for contempt. Now, seize those documents, every single one. What are you waiting for? That's an order. But the court officers didn't move. They exchanged uneasy glances. Something had shifted, something irreversible. Denzel stepped forward, utterly composed. Before they do that, Your Honor, perhaps you should explain why you're so desperate to seize these specific documents. I don't owe you an explanation, Sullivan snarled, pacing wildly behind the bench like a trapped animal. I am a federal judge. His voice was no longer powerful, just loud, and no one was listening. My decisions are final and absolute, Judge Sullivan declared, voice shaking with rage. My authority is unquestionable. Denzel Washington leaned back slightly, a flicker of quiet amusement in his expression. Absolute authority, Your Honor, he said calmly, seems to be a recurring theme with you, like in the Johnson case last week, where you ordered all evidence of your private meeting sealed. Sullivan froze mid-stride. How did you... He stopped abruptly, lips tightening. Those records were supposed to be... He caught himself, but the damage was done. Denzel tilted his head. Supposed to be what, Your Honor? Destroyed? Like the documents from your Progressive Justice Foundation meetings? Enough, Sullivan bellowed, his face contorted in fury. You self-righteous watchdogs think you can walk into my courtroom and expose... His breath caught in his throat. He had gone too far. Expose what exactly? Denzel pressed, voice cool and composed. Systemic abuse of judicial power? Coordinated suppression of civil liberties? Or the payments you've been receiving to... I said silence, Sullivan snapped, fully unhinged. He grabbed his gavel and hurled it across the courtroom, narrowly missing his own clerk. You want to talk about abuse of power? He roared. I'll show you abuse of power. Officers, I want this man in handcuffs immediately, and anyone who disobeys that order will be jailed for obstruction. The courtroom went eerily still. Even Sullivan's strained breathing echoed like thunder in the tense silence. The court officers didn't move. Their eyes flicked between one another, caught between duty and conscience. Sullivan leaned forward over the bench, eyes murk and wild. "Final chance, Mr. Washington," he growled. "Hand over those documents and submit to arrest, or I'll make sure you never set foot in another federal building again." Denzel simply opened another folder. "That's an interesting threat, Your Honor," he said. "Almost identical to what you told Rebecca Chen before dismissing her civil rights case, right after your meeting with CEO Marcus Webb." Sullivan turned ghostly pale. "What? How did you— Webb?" Denzel didn't even flinch. "The same Marcus Webb who deposited $300,000 into your Swiss account? The same Webb who hosted that exclusive resort meeting last month? The one attended by 6 federal judges who, days later, all ruled in his company's favor?" Sullivan's fists clenched at his sides. "You have no right!" he shrieked, spittle flying. "Those records are privileged. Those conversations were private." Denzel's voice turned sharp, precise. "Private? Like the recordings from your chambers?" Sullivan stumbled from a step. "What? Recordings?" The entire courtroom held its breath. Denzel turned slightly toward the clerk's desk. "The ones where you instructed your clerk to suppress evidence that would have cleared 4 civil rights defendants." A sharp gasp broke the silence. The court clerk burst into tears. "He made me do it," she cried. "He said he'd destroy my career if I didn't." "Silence!" Sullivan roared, but the power behind his voice had collapsed. His face was deep red, veins bulging, hands trembling uncontrollably. "None of this is admissible evidence. You can't prove—" "Actually," Denzel said, flipping a page with deadly calm, "every piece was obtained secretly." He held it high. "Your own security cameras caught the midnight shredding. Your phone recorded your threats. Your signature authorized the wire transfers." Sullivan lunged across the bench, reaching wildly. "Give me those files, now! I order you to—" A new voice interrupted from the back of the courtroom. "Order denied." The new voice came from the back of the courtroom. Every head turned in unison. A team of Justice Department investigators strode down the center aisle, badges gleaming under the courtroom lights. The lead agent's voice was firm, cold as steel. "This courtroom is now under federal investigation." He locked eyes with the judge. "Judge Emmet G. Sullivan, remain where you are." Sullivan's breath hitched. You can't do this!" he shrieked, his voice cracking. But no one was listening anymore. The reign of Judge Sullivan was over. "I have judicial immunity," he cried out, stumbling back from his bench. "I have powerful connections. Do you have any idea who I am?" The lead investigator stepped forward, unfazed. "Oh, we know exactly who you are, Your Honor," he replied coolly. "We know about your offshore accounts, your sealed meetings with the Progressive Justice Foundation, and your coordinated rulings targeting civil liberties advocates." Sullivan's eyes darted desperately across the room, scanning for an escape, a lifeline. "This is a setup," he gasped, voice now trembling. "A political trap, a leftist— a plot?" Denzel Washington cut in quietly. He stood tall, centered, and unshaken. "The only plot here, Your Honor, was your systematic abuse of power. Every biased ruling, every backroom deal, every attempt to silence the truth. It all ends today." Sullivan pointed a trembling, accusing finger at him. "You planned this. You and your righteous conspirators set me up." Denzel slowly shook his head. "No, Your Honor, you set yourself up." He stepped forward. "We simply gave you the opportunity to show the world who you really are. And today you did." The federal agents moved in toward the bench, but Sullivan wasn't done fighting. "I am a federal judge," he screamed. "You can't arrest me. I am the law. I am the law." He thrashed violently as 2 agents had to physically restrain him, just as he tried to lunge toward his chambers one last time. "You don't understand," he howled. "They made me do it. The foundation, they have dirt on everyone. If I talk, if I—" The lead investigator raised an eyebrow. "That's interesting. Why don't you start by telling us about the foundation, Your Honor?" Sullivan's mouth snapped shut instantly. His panic finally caught up with his pride. His eyes dimmed, his face twisted into a defeated sneer. "I want my lawyer," he muttered through clenched teeth. "And when this circus is over, you'll all pay for this humiliation." Denzel stepped forward, unshaken. "Speaking of payment," he said, withdrawing another document from his folder. He held it high for all to see. "Perhaps you'd like to explain these transfer records." Sullivan flinched. His breathing grew erratic. Denzel continued. 9 judges, all receiving identical deposits on the same day you did, all ruling against whistleblowers and citizen plaintiffs in synchronized fashion. The gallery erupted in gasps and whispers. This wasn't just a single corrupt judge. It was a network. Denzel's voice carried across the courtroom, steady and unwavering. The evidence suggests a coordinated effort to use the judicial system not as a shield of justice, but as a political weapon. He turned to face Sullivan directly. But justice, Your Honor, was never meant to be a weapon. It's meant to be a shield, one that protects every American equally. Judge Sullivan stopped struggling. The last of the fight drained from his face. He finally understood. Behind him, court officers entered his chambers and sealed the door. His clerk sat nearby, weeping, confessing everything. "He made me do it," she sobbed to investigators. "He threatened to destroy my life if I didn't help him cover it up." And in that moment, Denzel Washington didn't speak. He simply stood, letting the silence speak for itself, letting the system finally, mercifully, hold itself accountable. "He made me do it," the clerk sobbed, her voice shaking as federal agents questioned her. "He said he'd ruin my career if I didn't comply." Judge Sullivan's final walk of shame out of his own courtroom was more than just an arrest. It was a symbol that justice had caught up with him. But as the agents led him away in handcuffs, robes wrinkled and dignity shattered, he turned one last time to face Denzel Washington. His voice was cold, bitter, hollow. "You think this changes anything?" Denzel met his stare, steady, unwavering. "There will always be others like me. You can't stop us all." Denzel nodded slightly, his voice calm and firm. "You're right about one thing. There will always be those who abuse power." He paused, letting the silence land like thunder. "But there will also always be those who stand up to them. That's what makes our justice system work. Not the corruption you represent, but the courage of those who refuse to let it define us." The aftermath was swift and far-reaching. Sullivan's arrest triggered investigations across multiple jurisdictions. The network of compromised judges began to collapse, one ruling, one confession at a time. Witnesses who had once feared silence stepped forward. Whistleblowers were vindicated, and the truth, long buried, finally saw daylight. But perhaps the most powerful moment of all, when Harrison's case, the very case Sullivan tried so hard to suppress, was dismissed. A new judge reviewed the evidence. There was no merit, no fraud, no crime, only a man who had tried to help his community and nearly lost everything for it. In the end, justice wasn't decided by those who sought to control it, but by those willing to defend it. If you believe in truth, in courage, in standing up to power, then like this video and subscribe for more real stories that remind us why justice matters. God bless you, and God bless America.